Yuji is a character that I didn't think too much of at first. I'd always felt quite inspired by his tenacity and ability to keep moving forward, but initially I thought he was just your typical shonen protagonist. But as I started to look into Jujutsu Kaisen a bit deeper, I realized that there's a lot more to him that I didn't initially appreciate. So now I'm going to do exactly that. And just like the Gojo video, we'll go through in order. It will start anime only, with plenty of warning before any manga spoilers. So going straight into chapter 1, which has a very different post-ending reread feel to any other series that I've seen. And I think a big part of that is because it doesn't start with the main character declaring some kind of goal. You know, journey beyond the walls, become the greatest striker, stand on the court, become a hunter, become a hero, etc, etc. Instead, it's quite the opposite. Yuji starts with no goals. In fact, he's just kind of aimlessly wasting his time in this occult club, much to his PE teacher's disappointment. But that doesn't really matter to him because he's having a good time. And also, him being in the occult club saved it because it had enough members. And so to him, his actions had significance. It was something only he could do. Clearly, if he wanted to, he could become a professional athlete, but he just doesn't have any interest in that. But then there's obviously the scene with his grandpa dying. There's a consistent theme throughout of Yuji trying to find his place in the world, his purpose in society as such. And I think this is his thirst one, to simply help people, whether they're grateful or not, whether he feels right or he feels lost, just to help people. And the world of Jujutsu makes this a very tough thing to do, as we'll see. In fact, in many cases, his blind desire to help people regardless of the consequences to himself completely backfires. Just as a quick example, in the Shibuya Incident, he revolves himself to fight Chozo, no matter what happens to him, as it'd enable his fellow sorcerers to move forward to save Gojo, and his selflessness backfired. As a result, Sukuna was able to reawaken and massacre the city the way he did. Anyway, more on that later. But whilst I do think it's a pretty minor thing in the grand scheme of things, I do agree with the sentiment that a lot of people have about the scene that it would have benefited from a little bit more weight. You know, it's just a couple panels, Yuji pushes down his grief, and then everything moves on. And reading this back after seeing the whole series, it doesn't really invoke that much. Because even in the moments in the story where its influence is felt, there's typically far more significant things happening in those scenes which catch far more of our attention. Anyway, the last interesting thing about this scene is how it was actually encouraging Yuji to be less selfless moments prior, to go to his club he enjoys instead of coming to see him in hospital. The idea of selflessness versus selfishness is something that comes up a lot in the series, as I mentioned a moment ago. Speaking of, the chapter ends with Yuji eating Sukuna's finger, the moment that would both change the value and direction of his life forever. In the anime, he does it to save his own life as he's grabbed by the spirit, but in the manga, he's not at immediate risk at all. He does it purely to save the lives of others, obviously taking his grandpa's words into consideration. And yet, Megumi describes the 1 in 10,000 chance of Yuji surviving as the worst case scenario. Admittedly, he had no idea that Yuji would be able to fight back against Sukuna taking over his body. But regardless, it's an interesting point that the value of Yuji's life in this moment, in the eyes of Jujutsu society, took such a plummet. It's explicitly stated by Megumi that he doesn't even see him as human anymore, but instead as a curse. Obviously, the first instance of a struggle he continues to face from here on out. People seeing him as Sukuna's vessel, not Yuji Itadori, which of course is rather similar to the struggle Gojo has with people just seeing him as the strongest instead of Gojo. Anyway, Yuji manages to take control of his body again, and is weirdly calm for someone who just had someone else possess his body and talk about massacring people. Evidently, he has no idea what's going on right now, and that's not exactly surprising. But regardless, Gojo's confidence and demonstration that he can handle Sukuna is no doubt a huge relief to him, especially when we jump forward to the scene of the two talking, and he's informed that he's about to be executed. He's taken this news and this new world very well, and I think that's just part of who he is. You know, just like with his grandpa dying, he's able to move past these things and accept any kind of change pretty quickly. But I do think he also instinctively knows that Gojo is on his side and that he can trust him. Anyway, obviously the choice presented to him in die now or eat all the fingers of Sukuna and then die isn't much of a choice. You know, if I asked you if you wanted to die now or die later, it's pretty obvious which one you're going to pick. But regardless, when he speaks to Gojo about it, the main thing that comes up is his grandpa's words. And interestingly, Yuji talks about how he's decided how he's going to die, not decided how he's going to live. My first thought was that this was a very tunnel-visioned perspective from Yuji, not thinking about anything outside of his grandpa's last words. Although I suppose that's not surprising for a grieving young man. The point being, Yuji isn't really thinking about much outside of fulfilling his role in ending Sukuna, despite not even knowing that much about Sukuna. He's very content to just be given a role and carry it out. It seems as though he's not really thought this through at all, and in the following chapter, when Gojo takes him to Jujutsu High to meet the principal, he's tested on exactly that. He asks Yuji why he's come here, and Yuji just responds by basically repeating his grandpa's words and saying that he wants to help people, and that he doesn't care about the details. And for the first but far from the last time in the series, he's told something which makes him completely reconsider this ideal. If you were killed by a curse, would you then blame your grandpa for it? Which is obviously something that happens quite often to people. They follow a path pushed onto them by their parents, teachers, anyone other than themselves, and when it doesn't work out for them, they then blame and resent them. Anyway, after weighing this up for a bit, Yuji seems to let out how he really feels. Eating Sukuna is something only I can do. That if he were to escape his execution and this newfound duty, he'd simply spend his time relaxing. But he knows that eventually those feelings of remorse and guilt would catch up to him, that he'd begin to regret his decision. And this admittance seems to kind of turn his selflessness on its head. He's not doing it because of his selfless desire to help others, he's doing it for a more selfish desire to not feel guilt or regret at people dying due to his inactivity and not living up to his grandpa's words. However, it's pretty clear throughout the rest of the series that it's not that black and white. Like, of course it never is. It's very much a bit of both. He does genuinely want to help people, although it is partly due to him simply not wanting to deal with those regrets and with that guilt. And this isn't a criticism at all of Yuji. I think that's a very human thing to experience, and it's something I'll own up to thinking myself at times. Anyway, the principal accepts his answer, recognizing the honesty, and accepts him into the school. And shortly afterwards, he has his first mission. And I don't want to go through everything in these next episodes in extreme detail, but two things really stood out to me. Firstly, Yuji realizing how powerless he is in this new world. He doesn't have an ounce of agency over Sukuna. You know, his belief that Sukuna would care about him dying is proven completely wrong. It's been nothing more than a bit of an inconvenience for him. Secondly, how certain everyone else seems in their goals and a sense of purpose. For some, like Nobara, it's just as simple as living in Tokyo. And I know there's a good deal of reasons behind that, but on the surface it seems far more mundane than Yuji's. Yuji, on the other hand, after his plan to sacrifice himself in order to save everyone else, despite his initial confidence, very quickly regrets his decision. He regrets even eating that finger in the first place. The thought of helping people distorts into simply, I don't want to die, I want to run. And he seems to feel quite guilty for thinking that. You know, he's trying to shut all his thoughts out. Again, a completely human train of thought, although one a lot of shonen protagonists do seem to lack, which is something I really appreciate about Yuji. He's got a very good heart. He clearly cares far more for others than himself. He always wants to do the right thing, but he's not some completely unrealistic saint, missing all of these very human thoughts. Anyway, in this fight, he's forced to accept his powerlessness in the world he finds himself in, forced to allow Sukuna to take over in order to save his friends. In addition to being completely overpowered by this special grade curse, he also has to face Sukuna's brutal, unnegotiating nature. But we'll come back to that because whilst in control of Yuji's body, he removes his heart. Sukuna can survive this way, but Yuji can't, supposedly preventing him from switching back. But in spite of having felt the fear of death just moments prior, he still changes back with Sukuna. He still sacrifices himself for Megami's sake, becoming a shining example of that quote, bravery is not the absence of fear, but the ability to overcome it. And this, to me at least, is a huge part of Yuji's appeal. Even when following Yuji's death, in quotation marks for obvious reasons, Sukuna offers a deal with him to enable him to come back to life. Yuji still refuses it, becoming every bit as stubborn and unyielding as Sukuna, although unfortunately still not a fraction as strong as him. As per their agreement, due to Sukuna winning their fight, Yuji returns to life under Sukuna's conditions, which is of course very significant later on. Now, I've not got too much to say about his training with Gojo here. In fact, he's not really in these next few episodes much, so I'm going to jump ahead to the Mahito arc, where he meets Nanami, who is initially very cold towards him, being very upfront with his disapproval of Yuji. Obviously, we know how kind Nanami really is. This is essentially his form of tough love. But to Yuji, this is obviously pretty harsh to hear. This is also the arc which introduces Junpei, the character that really opens Yuji's eyes to the horrors of the world he's in, starting quite explicitly with the two talking about the horror movies they've seen and how awful they were. Yuji would have never seen these if Gojo hadn't made him do so, if he wasn't in the Jujutsu world. Later, after spending some time with Junpei's mum, Junpei asked him about killing, to which Yuji responds that he never wants to kill anyone, no matter how bad the person they are. Obviously an ideal that's proven to be very naive in the world of Jujutsu. A prime example is Sukuna, which Yuji seems to have just forgotten about. If Sukuna was fully revived and walking around, he would need to die. Otherwise he's just going to walk around killing countless people. But Yuji says he doesn't want killing to be an option. He doesn't want that choice to enter his life. Unfortunately, as we're well aware, Jujutsu society is not an easy place to live in with that kind of mindset. And we are quickly reminded why when we see a curse approaching Junpei's mum, before the scene cuts away. The death, or rather murder, of Junpei's mother would cause him to seek vengeance on those he believed responsible, as Mahito, her true killer, manipulated him into believing it would be one of his fellow students, so he returns to the school in order to see them. Now, of course, the words the series uses for ending the life of humans and curses are very different. Kill for humans and exercise for curse. Curses simply can't be reasoned with. They just act in accordance with their nature, whatever it may be, which is why Sukuna fits into the group perfectly, despite originally being a human. However, humans can be reasoned with, and so Yuji attempts to do just that. Junpei's Shinigami being a jellyfish is perfect, by the way. Those guys won't harm anyone if you leave them alone. He didn't want to either, but once provoked, that changes pretty quickly. As Yuji attempts to stop him from killing one of the other students, he then turns his Shinigami towards Yuji, who's able to pretty easily overpower him. But more than anything, Yuji's still baffled by this idea Junpei has of people don't have hearts, that they don't have morals or a desire to do good. But with everything Junpei's been through, from his bullying to his mum's death, it's completely understandable that he thinks this way. If his bullies had hearts, they would not have treated him the sadistic way they did. If his mum's killer had a heart, they wouldn't have done that to her either. The idea that the people who have done this to them have hearts is simply too much for Junpei to bear, as that would imply that all of this was for a good reason somehow, that it could be justified. Yuji hasn't really had anything like that happen to him at this point of time, except what Sukuna's done, obviously. But he doesn't see him as a person and instead more of a curse. But, and this is something I really like about Yuji, not only does he recognize that a blanket statement like everyone has hearts often doesn't carry weight in the real world, he actually openly admits it. He immediately apologizes for talking without knowing anything, for trying to say that he understands the world when it's filled with so many different people and outlooks that he simply hasn't seen yet. It's a real moment of maturity for him, and one that apparently a lot of people online have never ever had. And so Yuji invites him to Jujutsu High, where he won't be alone and they'll stop the one responsible for this. However, in classic Jujutsu Kaisen fashion, the moment someone realizes they're not alone is often just moments before their death. Mahito slams Yuji into the wall and then reveals his true intentions to Junpei, distorting his form and causing him agony. Yuji desperately pleads with Sukuna to change places and heal Junpei, even though doing so would result in the death of so many, including Junpei too, right? Given that the contract Yuji tries to form is just healing him and mentions nothing about leaving him alone afterwards. But he doesn't care about that. He just wants to help the person in front of him. But Sukuna not only has his own plans in motion, which I won't spoil here, and so has little reason to accept this offer. But also, as pointed out by Mahito, he probably could have fixed Junpei anyway, due to it being the soul he's affected rather than just the body. And this is the moment that Yuji realizes his naivety. These guys don't operate the way a normal human would. They don't have hearts. Doing the right thing isn't a concept they care about in the slightest. They are curses. As his rage boils over, he feels as though everything he said up to this point was a lie, that he wouldn't kill, that he cares about the right way to die, that everyone has a heart. It all pales in comparison to his overwhelming urge to kill. He puts aside so many of his past ideals, as though they're insignificant compared to what's in front of him. Ironically, however, this does actually come back to his original desire to do something only he can do, as he's the first person Mahito's encountered whose attacks are actually able to affect him. Ordinarily, people can't damage Mahito, but Yuji can. This is obviously one of the similarities that the two share, and it's far from the last. But obviously that's for later in the story. Although he does get some hits in, Yuji is still pretty weak at this point, and Mahito's ability is just way too OP for him to handle. Nanami shows up just in time, and we get a panel showing that Mahito is actually a pretty similar stage of his Jujutsu journey to Yuji. He's still learning the basics, what works and what doesn't work, and he's going to get a lot stronger than he is right now. Anyway, he sends his stock of reconstructed humans at Yuji, who he still believes won't kill. And Yuji is very reluctant to do so, despite them being clearly beyond the point of saving. Again, I think this is a situation that he hadn't considered before, that someone could be suffering so much that they'd ask him to kill them. And obviously, like, this is not the place for a debate around the ethics on that, but it'd be fair to say that it's not as simple as Yuji previously thought, you know? Yuji returns to the fight, and I'm not going to go through the rest in crazy detail, but realizing he's losing to the pair, Mahito opens up his domain expansion to trap Nanami inside and Yuji outside. Yuji breaks in, and due to Mahito's attack affecting Sukuna's soul too, he retaliates at Mahito. It is Sukuna who saves Nanami, not Yuji. In fact, if Sukuna decided not to attack Mahito back, the pair of them would have died then and there. Ironically, Yuji's complete lack of knowledge on Jujutsu is what saves him here. No other sorcerer would even consider breaking into a domain where death is guaranteed. Mahito flees, and when Yuji talks to Nanami later on, he's painfully aware that he wasn't at all able to save him. It's also where he has his discussion with Nanami around a proper death, and he realizes that he doesn't even understand what one is. He's so focused on trying to have one himself, and even making sure that everyone around him has a proper death. And yet, he really can't define what one actually is. Nanami, however, looks at this idea in a very kind of blunt, logical way, and also points out that Yuji's very black and white thinking he has, e.g. going back to when he thought everyone had a heart and killing is always wrong, it usually doesn't apply to reality. It's not quite as simple as classing people as good or evil, besides some, obvious exceptions. And so Yuji trying to fill this ideal is likely a pointless, unrewarding journey that he should just abandon. And with that, we move into the second half of season 1, where things get a little more lighthearted for a while. Yuji reveals to his classmates that he's still alive, and they're not too pleased at the way he goes about it. But it's at this event against their rival school Kyoto that Yuji encounters Todo, who really does fill that role of an older brother. However, their first encounter simply begins with Todo smashing him into this tree. Anyway, he quickly changes his mind on Yuji after hearing that the two have the same taste in women, and even protects Yuji from his fellow classmates trying to kill him. Which is a noteworthy point. I think Yuji had gotten used to not having to worry about the execution order, but although it's technically postponed, the reality is very different. He will have to bear that burden of being Sukuna's vessel for as long as he lives. Only now, he's found someone who very openly calls him a friend, completely different to the way Megumi and Nobara talk to him. Whilst they do care about him, they're not always particularly open about it. And so it's here that he's found someone who just doesn't care about him being Sukuna's vessel. He just sees him as his best friend. He even helps him out of his technique. It's at this point that the curses begin their attack on the school, sending the special grade curse Nanami at Yuji. Now, to be honest, as cool as this fight is, I feel like in terms of Yuji's development as a character, there's not too much to discuss here. You know, it's cool seeing him be able to actually fight a curse this strong, and we do get what will kind of become his signature move in Black Flash, of which he actually ends up matching Nanami's previous world record 4 consecutive uses of. He doesn't know that at the time, but regardless, I'm sure he sees Black Flash as his move, something he really prides himself on. Of course, that pride is later shattered the next time he fights Mahito, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, as cool as it is, we don't need a play-by-play of the whole fight here. It ends with Gojo saving everyone, and likewise for the baseball game. It's a fun little episode, and it's nice seeing Yuji being able to just kind of enjoy himself, but I don't feel like there's much in terms of analysis for Yuji here that we haven't said already, or will say later on. The season concludes with a fight against 2 death painting wombs, and again it's a cool fight. We see Yuji making use of his immunity to poisons that he has due to Sukuna, but in terms of Yuji as a character, the only really notable thing is his reluctance to kill them and his guilt after doing so regardless. Nobara isn't bothered by what they've done, and Yuji agrees with her point on how there was no way to restrain them, and they would have died if, you know, they hadn't killed them first. But he still feels guilt in spite of that, which is very understandable and kind of reminds me of Nanami's situation before he left Jujutsu Society. He knows someone has to do it, he just doesn't really want to be the one to do so. But that concludes season 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen. And obviously I went through the end pretty quickly there, but I felt like I would have just been repeating a lot of what I'd already said. So moving ahead to the Shibuya Incident, the night that changes everything and completely breaks Yuji in every way imaginable. It forces him to reconsider his ideals, accept things he didn't want to accept, and to see how horrifying the world really is. It's, in my opinion, Jujutsu Kaisen's best arc, and one of the best arcs in shonen. So we don't see Yuji for a little while in this. His first appearance being this fight against a grasshopper, which we definitely don't need to go into in any amount of detail, but shortly afterwards, Gojo, the strongest sorcerer in the world, the one whose very birth caused curses to become stronger in response to him, that man is sealed. And the first person to find out about it is Yuji, thanks to Mekamaru's contingency plan. He passes the message on to Nanami, who declares that if they can't rescue him, it's all over for all humans in this country. After breaking through the next barrier, Yuji rushes on alone, despite this not really being the smartest decision given his significance as Sukuna's vessel. If he were to be captured as well, it truly would be all over. But he's simply unable to just sit by and let everyone else act, nor is he okay with putting his life ahead of everyone else's. It doesn't take him too long to run into Chozo, the brother of the pair he killed at the end of the last season, and Yuji completely underestimates his power, losing his right arm as a result. But his heaviest hit was asking Yuji if his brothers had any final words. Initially, Yuji doesn't understand, but then realizes who he's talking about. He'd clearly tried to push his guilt to the back of his mind, and obviously with everything else going on right now, it's the last thing he would have been thinking about. But for what's far from the last time in this night, he's forced to wrestle with his ideals whilst also fighting for his life. This fight is a brutal, bloody battle that causes Yuji some serious physical damage. But the part I really want to focus on is on this line from Yuji here, after Mekamaru tells him to run into the bathroom so they can cause water to spray everywhere to limit Kurozo's technique. It works, but not well enough to stop Yuji's liver from being pierced. Yuji then says that he understands his role, and that for the sake of everyone else, even if it means dying, he's going to take this guy down. Now, I've noticed that throughout the series, Yuji feels most comfortable when he has a role to play, a mission to carry out. The consequences of that are completely irrelevant to him. The prime example being when Gojo told him to gather all the fingers of Sukuna and die after that. But perhaps the most tragic part of Yuji's character is that due to being Sukuna's vessel, his desire to help people often turns into hurting them instead. Part of this is caused by the fact that he is just completely unwilling to accept that part of his role means he has to be careful with the situations he places himself in. His insistence on helping people means he often completely disregards that. He doesn't value his own life anywhere near enough, gladly throwing it away and entrusting the rescue of Gojo to everyone else. And that very nearly happens. Chozo is able to outwit Yuji's plan that he felt so certain in, which I think has significance here, as just about everything else Yuji feels like he can have faith in is about to crumble over the rest of the night. He only survives due to Chozo suddenly gaining a memory of Yuji due to his curse technique having something to do with knowing when his relatives are about to die, which makes him realize that Yuji is a relative of his. But anyway, while subconscious, Jogo feeds Yuji 10 fingers in order to reawaken Sukuna. Funnily enough, Jogo has a similar mindset to Yuji in this moment. He's not interested in whether he survives or not, as long as his role is carried out and the Age of Curses returns. After taking on Jogo, Sukuna then rushes over to save Megumi, as due to reasons unknown at this point in the story, he has a particular interest in him. However, Megumi has summoned Maharaga, an absurdly powerful, regenerating, adapting Shinigami. Between his fight with Jogo and this one, using Yuji's body, he completely massacres Shibuya. The city is leveled by the time Yuji wakes up, and all of those memories flood into his head. Sickened to his very core, he immediately throws up, and in anger at himself, not Sukuna but himself, tells himself to die already, believing that his existence, his decision to keep living, has caused all the deaths he's seen. But he still has his grandpa's words. He still has things he needs to do, and above all he thinks that if he dies now, he'll be nothing but a murderer who gave up. He needs to make things right, so dying isn't an option for him. And for me, the cruelest part about this scene is that he knows that whilst he's grieving and breaking down, Sukuna is just laughing at him. He also probably thinks that right now Sukuna's won as such. He's succeeded in utterly breaking Yuji, or so it seemed. In spite of it all, with a dark, desperate resolve, he stands up and walks on. And unfortunately, his night has only just begun. The very first thing he sees upon returning to the underground is Mahito holding his palm against a thoroughly burnt Nanami, who, in his final moments, leaves Yuji with the iconic double-edged sword of a line. "You've got it from here." Much like his grandpa, these were well-intended words which, for someone living in the normal world, which Nanami also did for a while, it would be resourceful for them. But Yuji doesn't live in that world anymore. So to hear someone that he looked to as a mentor, as an adult figure that he could share his problems with, that he could rely on, to hear him then seemingly pass all responsibility onto Yuji, is probably the last thing he wanted in that moment. He'd just hit rock bottom. He's not thinking remotely straight. Gojo is gone, now his other mentor is gone. He's alone and afraid with no one left to guide him. And now his greatest enemy is standing right in front of him. Nanami didn't want to show any regret in front of Yuji. He didn't want Yuji to feel any guilt at his death, but unfortunately that's simply Yuji's nature. He shoulders everything that he might be even vaguely responsible for when looked at from every possible angle. Obviously, Yuji is aware of none of that, and instead goes into a blinded fury against Mahito, who, after a bit of brawling, says to Yuji, "You are me," to Yuji's complete and utter disapproval. Now, this time around, Yuji actually seems fairly evenly matched with Mahito, although it does feel as though the latter is merely toying with him. However, the reason their strength is so closely matched this time is revealed when Nobara's residence strikes through the Mahito in front of Yuji, as she's currently fighting a clone that he created by splitting himself in two, allowing Yuji to absolutely beat the crap out of him for a while, and more importantly, reminding him that he's not alone. Gojo and Nanami are gone, but there's still others on his side, something which sounds obvious, but I'm sure he forgot in the chaos of everything. However, Mahito manages to catch Nobara off guard, and Yuji is forced to watch yet another person close to him die in front of his eyes. In a similar fashion to Nanami, she doesn't show any regrets to Yuji. In fact, she tells him that it wasn't so bad, but that's honestly irrelevant to Yuji. Losing to Chozo, Sukuna's rampage, Nanami's death, and now this. Yuji's resolve had hit its limit a long time ago. And to top it all off, Mahito hits Yuji with a black flash. The sparks of black do not discriminate with who they bless. Despite the opening, Yuji is not special. Every single thing he stood for, everything he prided himself on, everyone he cares for, it's all crashing down around him. So not only does he see himself responsible for the murders Sukuna carried out, it's being thrown in his face that he's powerless to do anything about it, that he has no chance of making things right like he wanted to. Mahito could have easily killed him by now if he wanted him to, by morphing himself into something much sharper, but he doesn't. He's relishing in Yuji's suffering. It's as though the whole world is turning against Yuji, both inside and through Sukuna, and outside through Mahito, who calls out Yuji's half-assed determination he came to Shibuya with. And he has a point. Yuji simply came here with vague ideas of helping people, and not thinking about much else. But unfortunately, the world isn't run on ideas. It doesn't naturally make right what's wrong. It's one person, or curses, vision of truth against another, and Yuji is definitely losing that fight right now. Mahito has little reason for killing, he just does it simply because he believes it's right. He lives according to his instincts. Yuji has little reason for saving people. He saves people simply because he believes it to be the right thing to do. The instincts of a curse to kill, and the instincts of a human to help others. Mahito sees them as being the same thing, and the one who wins this fight is the one whose ideals will be proven to be correct. And of course, with Gojo now missing, the age of curses is quite possibly coming up. But it's at this moment that the Giga Chad among Giga Chads shows up. The man himself, Todo. He tells Yuji to stand up, but all his darkest thoughts spill out. You know, the absolute worst angle to see a situation from, and yet one that's always been in the back of his mind. It's been there the whole time, but I couldn't even bring myself to say it because of how cruel it is. Sukuna killed so many people, so I've tried to help more people than he killed, but I couldn't do anything. So I'm just a murderer. What I thought was my conviction was just an excuse, which likely refers to his decision to live way back at the start of the series. He chose not to die, and as a result, Sukuna's massacre happened. And now he's saying that his resolve to save people deep down may have just been an excuse to live longer. He can no longer forgive himself for making that decision. The amount of suffering that this poor boy has been through, and he blames himself for all of it, all because he genuinely wanted to help people. To be very clear, whilst I see where he's coming from, I really don't think it's true. Was it a dumb decision to run off to fight Chozo? Yes, but he's still not the one who killed all those people, and Todo's response is simply perfect, starting with his iconic poem. Forgive me if I pronounce anything wrong here. The sound of the Gion Shoujo bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The color of the Sada flowers reveals the truth that the prosperous must decline. This is part of an original poem, essentially talking about how time comes to us all. You know, everything and everyone will pass on at some point. But Todo adds a second part, that we are the exception. Now, that seems to go against the original poem's meaning, but in no way do I think this is him denying that he will die someday, but instead that they can live on, the same way Yuji talks about Nanami and Nobara. In spite of their death, their ideals, their wisdom and hope that they pass on to Yuji is still there. Although everything around them is ending, Yuji and Todo are still here. And as long as they live, their friends who have passed are not defeated. But he also now completely refutes Yuji's idea of a good death. For a big chunk of the series, Yuji was trying to assign meaning to people's deaths, including his own. But right now, he can't see one for Nanami or Nobara. But Todo tells him to stop trying to do so, as doing so could potentially even defile the memories of those they've lost. The way they lived was enough. Their deaths don't need meaning as well. He then asks Yuji what he's been entrusted with, telling him to keep moving forward until he finds it, and describing it as a punishment. And this is exactly what Yuji needed to hear. Firstly, remember what I said earlier about how Yuji really appreciates having a purpose to work towards. Todo has essentially given him one, albeit short term, to simply keep moving, to keep fighting. But I also think that describing it as a punishment is something Yuji needed to hear, as that'll allow him to see that as his punishment, as what he needs to do to make things right, as opposed to anything more extreme. And so hats off to Todo here, because he was a perfect big brother in this moment. You know, exactly what Yuji needed with Nanami and Gojo out the picture. He then starts fighting Mahito himself until Yuji's ready, and then switches places with a newly resolved Yuji, who apologizes to Nanami for having given up, for using his sins as an excuse to run away, for wallowing in self-pity and giving up on his drive to help people. And this really inspires me whenever I see it. You know, he suffered so much in the last few minutes alone, and yet he's still fighting. He's still pushing forward. Todo's words recovered his spirit, and his black flash recovered his cursed energy. Itadori Yuji has returned, and the final showdown against Mahito begins. Realizing that he can't handle the pair of them, he wants to use his domain, but he can't because of Sukuna, and so he copies Gojo, using a domain lasting 0.2 seconds, and forcing Todo to slice up his hand to stop Mahito's technique from spreading across his whole body, which seemingly renders the technique useless as he can no longer clap. But Todo is every bit as smart as Mahito, using his hand to complete a clap and allow Yuji to get another clean hit in. Mahito then claims that he's found the true essence of his soul, his perfect four, and Yuji is powerless before it. His hits aren't denting him at all, realizing that his only hope is to hit him with a black flash, the move which no sorcerer, not even Gojo, can use at will. His fate is completely out of his hands, and no doubt his recent run of bad luck is something he's very conscious of. Todo hits his Netero reference, declaring that an applause is the acclamation of the soul. Although his technique didn't fire, the distraction it gave allowed Yuji to land a black flash, reducing Mahito to his knees, who now vomits in the same way Yuji did moments prior. And as Mahito looks up, he hears Yuji accept, "I'm you." He doesn't care about right or wrong, meaning or purpose. He doesn't care what Mahito does or how many times he comes back. He's just going to kill him. He's simply tired of it all. After everything these curses have put him through, after all the people they've killed, he's just going to exercise them forever. Now, he hasn't completely given up on the idea of this all meaning something beyond just himself, as he does mention about maybe hundreds of years from now, there may be some meaning to it all, but he doesn't really care if there is or not. He's now fully resigned himself to this role. Meaningful or not, he is a Jujutsu sorcerer. The tables have been fully turned. You might notice how Mahito looks an awful lot like Junpei with the way his hair is. Mahito killed Junpei because that's just in his nature. Yuji will now do the same because that's in his nature. After that incident, Mahito declared that he just wanted to kill Yuji. Now Yuji will simply kill Mahito. And don't get me wrong, he's fairly justified in doing so, but the point is that it no longer matters to him. In his eyes, he's just a cog in this big machine, fulfilling his role in it. But before he gets a chance to finish Mahito off, a possessed Geto appears and absorbs him whilst Yuji lacks the strength or stamina to stop him. It really does feel at times as though the story is almost mocking Yuji. He just resolved to single-mindedly exercise curses, sacrificing many of his previous ideals, and yet now he's failed to even do that. It's as though even without Sukuna's meddling, the world will automatically kind of remind him of his powerlessness. And so Geto flees with Gojo's seal and leaves Yuji all alone. Without Gojo, Japan enters this almost apocalyptic state. The postponement on Yuji's execution is now officially lifted, so he's basically back where he was at the very start of the series. Everyone's out to get him, but this time there's no Gojo to protect him. He doesn't feel safe returning to Jujutsu High, as he can tell Sukuna is planning something involving Megami, and he doesn't feel as though he can face anyone following that massacre. And on top of all of that, whilst he doesn't know this, Yuta is on his way to execute him, a sorcerer far stronger than he is. Yuji has been left well and truly alone. He's had to struggle on through horror after horror, carrying it all with him this whole time, and yet he's still standing. He's still moving forward. And to do that in a world that seems to be actively mocking him is something I find truly inspiring. But with that, we conclude the anime-only content. I know there was a slightly anticlimactic end, I apologise for that, but that is the end of Season 2. So do be aware there will be spoilers beyond this point, but I do have other spoiler-free JJK videos if you're interested in those. But moving ahead, if you're still here, you know that he's not quite completely alone. He has Chozo with him, and in classic shonen fashion, he's able to progress his power at a rate far higher than anyone else, now adding control and finesse to his already high power. However, we then of course have the stage execution of Yuji, with Yuta seemingly killing him, but using reverse curse technique to heal him, as a request from Gojo. But what I really want to focus on is their conversation here, where Yuta tries to tell him that it's not his fault, that being Sukuna's vessel isn't something he chose for himself. But as Megami shows up and asks him to return to the school, Yuji erupts, claiming that lots of people died because of him. And it's especially interesting that Yuta notes that Yuji is still undecided on whether or not he deserves to live, hence he even held back during their fight. This is something that happens quite a lot with Yuji. He resolved himself to just be a cog and just exercise curses, but now he doesn't even know if he should live or not. But again, it's not surprising that his ideals change as often as they do with how chaotic everything is. We've seen ever since his encounter with Junpei that he's very open to having them challenged and accepting where he may be wrong. And now he's concerned about Sukuna's plans for Megami, who informs Yuji that he now needs his help in the upcoming Culling Game in order to save his sister, which I'll put the rules on the screen quickly as a reminder, but the summary is basically that players get points for killing other players. At 100, they can add a new rule to the game, with sorcerers being worth 5 points and non-sorcerers worth 1. If someone's score stays the same, i.e. they don't kill anyone for 19 days, then they have their cursed technique removed, i.e. if they're a sorcerer, they die. Returning to the conversation, Yuji asks Yuta to kill him if it comes to it, stating that you could do that, essentially passing the burden of deciding whether or not he lives to Yuta. And it's also a bit of a callback to his initial motivation of doing something only I can do, which again he's passed on to Yuta. And once again, despite his selfless intentions, it could be seen as a bit of a selfish request by Yuji, as it does kind of endanger Yuta's life. Anyway, I kind of want to skip through the meeting with Tengen because it becomes a slightly wasted character in the grand scheme of things, and this conversation has very little to do with Yuji as a character. But Tengen does give them the back of the prison realm, a hope of unsealing Gojo, and informs them that the player known as Angel can allow them to unseal him. However, before that, they're asked to meet up with the gambling kingpin, Hikari. I won't spend too long on the way they meet and Yuji's infiltration into his arena, but I do want to talk about this bit here, which really sums up what I was saying earlier about Yuji never really being too sure on his convictions. Hikari questions Yuji on his motivations for coming here, and his only response is, "Because I was told to. My upperclassmen said so," much to Hikari's disappointment. He repeatedly states that his role is just a cog, his role is just to exercise curses, and that if he needs Hikari's help to do that, he won't leave until he does so. But as Hikari points out, if he truly has resigned himself to that kind of state, his eyes are burning awfully bright. There's this constant disconnect between what Yuji says and how he actually feels. It's been there since the start, hence the iconic "it made everything I'd set up to this point sound like a lie" in his fight against Mahito, as though he's almost ashamed to admit what he's really thinking. But anyway, determined to change the rules so they don't have to kill, they track down the players who already have 100 points. In particular, Higuruma, a lawyer turned sorcerer. I hope I pronounced it right, I'm sorry if not. And I love this guy. His domain is probably my favourite in the whole series. You know, I really wish Gege wrote more domains like this where it's not just an instant kill effect, instead it trials people for their past crimes, and depending on the verdict, certain effects can happen. But what Yuji gets tried for is the mass murder at the Shibuya Incident, the one carried out by Sukuna, the one that Yuta Megami told him wasn't his fault, and that he was unconscious at the time of happening, and yet he claims himself guilty, that he was the one responsible, and is sentenced to his death as a result, granting Higuruma the Executioner Sword, with its one-hit kill effect. But in spite of his guilt, in spite of accepting the blame, Yuji doesn't allow himself to be executed. He bears that burden and fights back in spite of it. Higuruma, disagreeing with Yuji's guilt, declares him innocent in the eyes of the law due to not having control and not willingly giving it up. Out of respect for Yuji, he uses his 100 points to allow the transferring of points to other players, thereby preventing the need for anyone to kill anyone else, as they can just transfer 1 point back and forward to make sure their score changes. And as such, it becomes Yuji's most successful attempt at saving people's lives in quite a while. And the irony of it all is that it came from him not trying to. It was the acceptance of his fate that saved people, but more on that later. We don't see Yuji for a long time after this, with the next instance being when they finally meet the Angel, who offers her cooperation in unsealing Gojo in exchange for killing the Fallen One, who is unfortunately Sukuna, meaning Yuji will have to give his life in exchange for Gojo, a trade he's very much willing and ready to make. And by this point in the series, unfortunately the pattern is very clear. We know something awful is on the way. By the way, at the same time as this, Kenjaku goes to see the US to tell them about Curse Energy, and I'm sure we'll see the fallout of this and, you know, the way knowledge of Curse Energy affects the US and the world as a whole. That will definitely be mentioned again. Same with the merger in the following chapter. Anyway, after Hana realizes that Megami saved her as a child, she agrees to help them. They're able to track down Megami's sister, and the two reunite. Meanwhile, Yuji makes peace with his fate, thanking Gojo and Megami for giving him a role to play, and I think he sees this being pretty close to that ideal death his grandpa spoke about in episode 1. But Megami's sister is not Megami's sister, but instead an incarnated sorcerer using her as a vessel, and to make matters even worse, in the moment when Megami's soul is weakened through the loss of his sister, Sukuna finally makes his move. Back when Yuji died at the start of the series, the binding vow Yuji made with him included the conditions that Sukuna would be able to take back over for 1 minute at any given moment, but he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone in that time. However, that condition did not include Yuji himself, hence Sukuna is able to rip off one of his fingers and force feed it to Megami, gaining control of him. But the key part here is, if Yuji had paid even the slightest bit of attention to himself, instead of single-mindedly obsessing over others, this wouldn't have been able to happen. Once again, the cruelest curse Yuji has to endure is that because of Sukuna, his attempts to help people always backfire. Him and Maki then attempt to 2v1 Sukuna, and if you take a close look at this railing Sukuna crashes into, Yuji then uses it to try and trap Sukuna. But do you notice how it kind of looks like multiple pairs of scissors, except they're completely useless? Yuji's resigned himself to being a tool and fulfilling a role. Much like these scissors without an edge, he's found himself completely useless at it, unable to carry out what he was made to do. Anyway, Arami's ice allows Sukuna to escape, and in a very similar fashion to Shibuya, Yuji can only watch as the one he attempted to save is carried off away from him. And whilst they won't go through the fight, Yorozu, who's currently in Megami's sister's body, fights Sukuna and loses, putting Megami in the same situation Yuji was after the massacre in Shibuya, something he told Yuji not to blame himself for, but now can't help doing that. Now he's in that same situation. Following this, we have the return of Gojo, and of course his phenomenal fight against Sukuna, which I won't spend long on, but it shows Yuji just how large the gap between him and Sukuna actually is. He always knew, but he'd never seen Sukuna's full power on display until now. The closest he'd seen was that massacre at Shibuya, and of course, following Gojo's death, Sukuna only gets even stronger as he returns to his true form. Following Kashimo's death at the end of their 2-chapter fight, Yuji finally joins the fray, and for the first time in the series, outside of their little fight, if you could call it that, following Yuji's death at the very beginning, but Yuji is finally fighting Sukuna. He's finally given the chance to end him for good. And again, we won't go through a play-by-play of the entire fight, but Sukuna has basically no interest in Yuji. Everyone else in the gauntlet Sukuna runs is of far more interest to him. In fact, in the following chapter, 248, when it's just Yuji remaining against him, Sukuna just finds himself being annoyed by his resolve. And then, jumping ahead to when Yuta joins the fight and uses Angel's technique on Sukuna, Yuji is finally able to speak to Megami's soul, only to find it utterly shattered, with him again in the same state Yuji was in Shibuya. And Yuji doesn't know how to help him. He doesn't know how to save him or what to say. He's incapable of saving his friend from a fate he previously suffered, but he doesn't waste any time dwelling in his self-pity. There's no bargains to be made this time or help on the way. He just has to stand up and keep fighting. And at the end of 256, he finally lands a clean black flash on Sukuna and can now stand against him, chaining together 2 more black flashes and then using Cleave himself, with little scissors representing Yuji's mindset as a tool. A 4th black flash lands, and Sukuna silently fumes at Yuji's newfound strength. As the 5th and 6th land, he roars in anger at this child, this boy who's actually pushing him back, as Yuji finally dishes out some real pain to what has caused him immeasurable suffering over the last year. A 7th black flash lands, and Sukuna opens his domain in response. Yuji is actually able to stand against his domain now, using a simple domain to counter it. But his victory is once again proven shallow, as Sukuna's furnace annihilates the surrounding area and Chozo gives his life to protect Yuji from it, leaving him isolated and alone once more, until Todo once again shows up and buys just enough time for Yuta, now controlling Gojo's body, to return to the fight. The group is able to get some good hits, but it's just not enough to take down Sukuna, until at the end of 264, to Sukuna's absolute horror, Yuji uses the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery, Domain Expansion. And the following chapter is my favorite in the entire series. Chapter 265 sees Yuji taking Sukuna on a walk around his old hometown. Yuji himself doesn't understand what's going on, but he just says he wants to talk to Sukuna. Initially, I kind of dreaded this, fearing that Yuji's naivety was back and would get a talk no jutsu type of scene, but thankfully that is not at all what happens. For the first time since swallowing that finger, Yuji gets to make Sukuna listen to him, and he doesn't insult him, ask him for an explanation or anything like that. Instead, he just walks him around all these happy and unhappy memories he had as a child. He then challenges him to see who can catch a bigger crayfish, which, aside from being hilarious, the way the two talk about who has the better fish reminds me of the little jokes Sukuna and Gojo had. It's as though Sukuna actually sees Yuji as an equal in here. Yuji takes him through all these childlike, innocent questions that he used to have, about pesticides getting stronger, for example. But then we get the really interesting bit, where he starts talking about Christmas, and in particular about how he used to hear bells outside at night, and in his childlike naivety, believed it was Santa, only for that illusion to be broken later on, when he realized it was just snow chains on tires. That naive vision shattered, much like any remaining naivety present-day Yuji has when Sukuna interrupts him, telling him that he's seen enough, that his blathering is disgusting, and he needs to get to the point. And that point ends up being one of my favourite parts in the whole series. So the next panel shows Grandpa, Junpei, and Nanami, obviously all characters who have died, and Yuji talks about how he used to think that understanding and fulfilling his role is what it meant to live, and if he died fulfilling his role, he could say he died the right way. But now he feels different about it. He's finally abandoned this idea of a proper death, and what he replaces it with is beautiful. The next panel shows Nobara, Kozo, and Gojo, and Yuji says such a beautiful line that your role can be just walking the dog or providing for a family. Even without that, even if all you do is eat and sleep, even if you're bedridden with illness, if you're disconnected from everyone else and leave nothing behind, there's still value in the fragments of memories drifting around. That's what really matters. And wow, just wow. To see this young man who's suffered so much, who's had to deal with world-ending stakes and a never-ending cycle of I'll be happy once this happens, with the this sometimes being his own death, for him of all people to project the idea of chasing after some grand purpose and to instead value all these little moments is something that deeply moved me the first time I read it. Nanami would be exceptionally proud of him if he heard him say this. He wanted to show Sukuna all these moments to show him the humanity of someone other than himself. And as I'll come back to, I believe he was doing so to insult Sukuna, who responds surprisingly honestly. He says that he gets what Yuji's saying, he really does. It just does nothing for him. He just doesn't care. Little moments like the one Yuji showed him, the idea of living the way Yuji described, it just genuinely does nothing for him. And this isn't him being rude, he's just being honest. For the very first time, he is actually being completely level with Yuji. But that was not the reason Yuji showed him all of this. I love this bit. Yuji accepts his response with pretty much no argument. And Sukuna is baffled by this. He doesn't understand why Yuji doesn't hate him more after everything he's put him through. And then it clicks that there's a reason for that. It's because Yuji genuinely pities Sukuna and his way of living, stuck chasing the next rush without these little moments of genuine meaning and connection. He pities the man described to be the most conceited and prideful in the world. And Sukuna fully realizes this. So it is a perfect revenge from Yuji against the man who caused him so much suffering. And now Yuji is fully in control over him. He's no longer naive enough to bother talking further and just orders Sukuna to obey him and release Megami or die, to which Sukuna tries to drag him back into the old curse, claiming his attempts to do this will cause others to suffer. Now, the next chapter is heartbreaking. 266 begins with Megami talking to Yuji. Talks about how he'd love the kind of life Yuji mentioned, just enjoying the simple things of his sister. In fact, he'd be happy seeing her with someone like Yuji. But now, he's had enough. He doesn't think himself deserving or capable of that. And there's this really heartbreaking scene where Yuji talks about how when his grandpa was seriously ill, there were mentions of euthanasia given the condition he was in. His grandpa tried to struggle on, ignoring all the treatments offered to him due to their strong side effects. He says his grandpa was in a hopeless situation, one that he couldn't emphasize with at the time, just, from being a young boy. But ever since going through everything he has, he kinda gets it. In fact, he even understands why someone wouldn't want to continue living, as that's been him multiple times. And so Yuji says goodbye to his friend. He doesn't want him to keep suffering, but he'll miss him dearly because it'll be lonely without him. Very lonely. And evidently that sparked something in Megumi, who begins to fight back against Sukuna's control. The battle enters its final phase, with the pair landing some heavy hits to each other's head, but Sukuna manages to reset his burnt out technique in the same way as Gojo, and begins to open his domain, which Yuji has no way to counter, so it's seemingly the end. But Yuji is missing a finger besides the one Sukuna tore off earlier. Yuta's secret plan to bluff out Sukuna is revealed. He used Yuji's finger to copy cleave, not Sukuna's, meaning one of Sukuna's fingers is still out there somewhere, which wouldn't make any difference ordinarily or under any other circumstances, besides Nobara coincidentally waking up in the middle of this fight. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the timing here, but anyway, she's able to use her resonance to strike Sukuna from afar and prevent him from opening his domain, allowing Yuji to finally finish him off with one last black flash. After doing so, and Megumi separating from him, he offers Sukuna one last chance to live, claiming that you are me, that they were both born with the burden of a curse, but thanks to Yuji's grandpa, he didn't end up like Sukuna, and so he now wants to be that person for Sukuna, giving him a chance to live life appreciating these small things instead of relying on strength alone. Sukuna, being Sukuna, refuses and passes on. So 2 panels later, we get Nobara reuniting with the gang as though nothing happened, which I don't dislike the ending as much as some people, but this did feel extremely rushed. Anyway, in the series finale, we get Yuji going on one final mission with the gang, and of course, the flashback of Gojo passing the torch on to Yuji, telling him he has faith in him and that he's counting on him. Words Yuji then passes on to the troubled sorcerer they apprehend in their mission. Yuji puts it all behind him and continues to help people. Only this time it seems as though he's put all these ideas of dying a certain way, etc. out of his head. Now living with a much healthier mindset, having pushed through his year of suffering and came out the other side, now far more aware of how awful the world can be, but seemingly just as optimistic about it as he was before it all began. And with that, we conclude Yuji's story. So if you want more JJK videos, click on the playlist on screen. Many thanks to AutoGyro for joining as a channel member. Thank you very much if you watched all the way to the end, and have a great day.